These 10 dialogue mistakes will ruin your fantasy novel. How do I know? Well, I've coached over 150 fantasy writers in my classes and programs, and I've read through hundreds and hundreds of applications from writers who have wanted to work with me. I even recently ran a live workshop where I helped writers fix their dialogue in real time. And from publishing 4 fantasy novels and a video game myself, I've had to identify and correct these mistakes in my own writing as well. So today I'm going to be breaking down these 10 mistakes and showing you exactly how to fix them with clear before and after examples. And to explain the first mistake, let's study an example of bad dialogue. See if you can work out why this sucks. For a bit of context, in this scene we have 2 characters gathered around a campfire the night before a major battle. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" asked Jurad. "I'm really scared," said Thomir. "What if I die and I never see my brother again?" "I'm scared too," said Jurad. "The Moravians outnumber us 5 to 1. I just don't see how we're going to win." So why does that suck? Well, it's because there's no subtext. There is no filter between what the characters think and what they say. All their emotions are right out there on the surface. This is the first big mistake you want to avoid because a lack of subtext makes your dialogue feel dumbed down. It flattens your characters by giving us no chance to ponder their inner lives. That's because their inner lives are right there on the surface. There's no digging required. Instead, great dialogue makes readers work for it. To quote Andrew Stanton, the director of Finding Nemo and WALL-E,
"Make the audience put things together. Don't give them 4, give them 2 plus 2.
So let's see if we can try to improve our bad dialogue example by adding in some more subtext. Jurad gazed across the dark plains at the Moravian campsite a mile away. "There's a lot of fires over there." Thomir grunted. He took a swig of his mead. Jurad turned back to warm his hands by their own campfire. "None as good as the one you've made, of course," said Jurad. "I can't take credit. My brother taught me how to make them, back before." A shadow passed over Thomir's bearded face. "I never showed Matti the way." That was Thomir's younger brother, his only brother now, after yesterday. Jurad forced a smile onto his face and slapped Thomir's muscled shoulder. "You'll show him when you're back." Thomir snorted. "When?" Jurad nodded. "When?" Can you see the difference there? Here, it's clear that Jurad is nervous about the enemy army and he's trying to cheer up himself and Thomir, who is rather more pessimistic. Yet the information is delivered in a way that makes readers dig for it. There's layers, inference, hidden meaning. This is what it actually means to show, not tell. And it results in a scene that is far more interesting. But even with subtext, your dialogue will fall flat if you make the next mistake. And to explain this second mistake, let me show you another example of bad dialogue. And again, see if you can figure out what's going wrong here. So in this scenario, we've got 3 thieves who are on a rooftop. They're overlooking a manor. They're planning to break in to steal a magical goblet that belongs to the Lord inside. Here's the scene. "We have to distract the guards somehow," said Thorn. "Yes," said Elira. "They'll notice us if we approach." "Maybe we should make a noise," said Varric. It feels pretty lifeless, right? Everyone sounds the same. All the characters are interchangeable. There's no distinctive sense of voice or personality. I call this second mistake clone speak, and you want to do everything you can to avoid it. Let's try to fix this example. "Oh," Thorn swallowed. "I didn't think there would be that many guards." "No need to worry," said Elira. "We'll simply need to distract them. There's a forge a few streets north. Perhaps we could set that on fire and lure them away." Varric scoffed. "Or we could just kill them." You can already tell a lot more about their personalities, can't you? You can see Thorn is nervous and worried, Elira is a thoughtful planner, Varric is aggressive and maybe a little bit brutish or callous, and we have fixed the clone speak issue. Now, if you are paying close attention here, you will notice that I am maybe cheating a little bit with my new dialogue. How so? Well, I've added in a few action beats to better show their personalities. These are the pieces like Thorn swallowed or Varric scoffed. And while you don't necessarily want to get carried away with these, they can be a fantastic tool to sprinkle around your dialogue. Now, with your own writing, here's a great test to make sure that you are not accidentally writing clone speak. What I want you to do is take a page of dialogue from your novel, then cut out all the character names, the dialogue tags, and all the actions that are surrounding the dialogue. So you're basically just left with a screenplay-style transcript of your dialogue. Then take that and show it to a friend or a fellow writer, and get them to describe the personalities of each speaker, just using a few words like I did earlier. If they can then get an accurate sense of your characters' personalities just from these few pieces of dialogue, then you are absolutely on the right track here. But how do you actually create a unique sense of voice for each character's dialogue in your novel? Well, there are all sorts of techniques you can use, like defining each character's conversation approach. Is your character blunt and straightforward, or do they speak with very veiled insults and innuendo? Do they ask a lot of questions or make a lot of statements? Do they always hedge their words, or are they very absolute and determined in their phrasing? Do they say exactly what they're thinking, or do they keep their true thoughts sort of hidden beneath the surface? Sandan Glocker in Joe Abercrombie's First Law series is a fantastic example of this because as a crippled inquisitor, he is often forced to project a very polite and inoffensive facade to avoid the ire and wrath of his superiors. But we get a lot of internal thought from him that shows his true opinions, along with the occasionally barbed and very sarcastically witty comment. Consider this exchange between Glocker and a governor's son in the second book in this series, before they are hanged. "I am Corsten Dan Worms. The Lord Governor's son spoke his own name as though it was a magic spell, offered his hand to Glocker as though it was a priceless gift. He was blonde-haired and handsome, spread out carelessly in his chair, a well-tanned glow of health about him, as lithe and athletic as his father was ancient and wizened. I despise him already." So, side note here, the little italicized sections, that's Glocker's internal thoughts. "I understand that you were once quite the swordsman." Worms looked Glocker up and down with a mocking smile. "I fence myself, and there's really no one here to challenge me. Perhaps we might have a bout." "I'd love to, you little bastard. If I still had my leg, I'd give you a bout of the shits before I was done." "I did fence, but alas, I had to give it up. Ill health." Glocker leered back a toothless smile of his own. "I dare say I could give you a few pointers, though, if you're keen to improve." Worms frowned at that, but Glocker had already moved on. So see here how he's just using his wit and his intellect to sort of cut Corsten down in this very sort of sarcastic and indirect way. Now, the second thing you can be thinking about here to create unique voices in your character's dialogue is to look at their vocabulary and jargon. So every character is going to have different life experiences in your story. That means a pirate might use a lot of sailing metaphors, a scholar might use very precise technical terms or use a lot of quotes from dead philosophers and poets, and an immortal mage might use a lot of outdated language and sayings that he picked up in his childhood 600 years ago, but it makes no sense now for the other characters due to technological progression or societal change. Vocabulary can also be a fantastic way to create class-level conflict in your story. For example, in Red Rising by Pierce Brown, Darrow is a red. He is basically the slave who toils beneath the surface of Mars to provide for the high colors, like the golds who sit at the top of society. Now, after Darrow's wife is killed early in the book, Darrow disguises himself as a gold and infiltrates their academy, planning to destroy it from within. Early in the book, we see him use the phrase "bloody damn" as a common red curse. But as he's sort of getting etiquette lessons to learn how to pretend to be a gold, he learns that golds would never say that. Instead, their main curse phrase is "gory damn." But later, Darrow accidentally says "bloody damn" in this very tense situation, and it makes another character a bit suspicious about his true nature. That's a great example of how you can sort of use vocabulary and jargon to create a lot of tension and conflict in your story. The third thing to be thinking about here to create unique voices is looking at sentence length and structure. Give each character a different rhythm to their speech. Some characters might speak in very short and clipped sentences, while other characters might ramble on with long, winding thoughts and lots of digressions and tangents, and just they don't shut up, a little bit like me. Some characters might speak in very complete and formal sentences. Others speak in fragments. Some might never use contractions, and others might drop words entirely and speak in a very sort of clipped and abrupt shorthand. The fourth thing to be looking at here is personal quirks and repeated phrases. Real people have little verbal habits. This is something you should pay attention to next time you're talking with your friends. Maybe your character always swears by a unique oath, like "by the Black Seas" or "Odin's beard." Maybe they have a habit of repeating words, like saying no, that's not what I meant." And they say the whole no, or yes kind of thing. Maybe they always answer a question with another question. So even something as small as this little kind of quirk makes them feel distinct. When you can apply even just a few of these principles here, your dialogue stops feeling like clone speak and starts feeling so much more realistic and textured. Ultimately, though, the best method is to simply understand and develop your characters in as much detail as possible. Because once you understand your character's flaws, motivations, background, relationships, and all the other aspects of their psychology, you will find it incredibly intuitive and easy to write their dialogue. It will just feel like it's flowing naturally from you. And to do this, I highly suggest that you join my free 5-day character development course. Inside, I'll show you the most useful character building techniques that I've personally learned from publishing my 4 fantasy books and a video game. along with coaching over 150 other writers in my various programs and classes. It's completely free. Over 2,600 fantasy writers have already gone through it, and they've left a ton of amazing reviews. Here's one review from Daniel Wilford, who said, "Before I took this 5-day crash course, my characters were flat, dull, and hardly had one dimension. But afterwards, I improved in ways I didn't even realize were possible. You can join my character course for free by going to jedherne.com/5-day course, or by using the link in the description below." Now, the next common dialogue mistake is one of the easiest to fix, but it has a major impact on the quality of your writing. And this third mistake is not reading your dialogue out loud. Your dialogue might seem totally fine on the page, but if you don't read it out loud, you're missing one of the easiest ways to spot awkwardness. I actually did this recently in a live dialogue critique workshop, and when I read some writers' scenes out loud, it just made a massive difference because you could just immediately tell, hey, this scene needs a bit of tweaking, this phrase doesn't quite work. So why is it so important to read your dialogue out loud? Well, to start with, any unnatural phrases become very obvious when spoken. Repetitive sentence structures stand out, and you can also catch overly long or convoluted sentences that just would never flow naturally in a conversation because, you need to take a breath after a certain amount of speaking. And my personal favorite is that sometimes you can write accidental rhymes or repetitive sentences that look fine on the page because your eyes just sort of skim over them, but they feel super awkward when you read them out loud or when a reader hears them in an audiobook. So for example here, "We have to go, Joe," Mira shouted. "No time to be slow. We need to reach the plateau before the river overflows." So on the page, that might not seem too bad, you might not notice it, but when you read it out loud, you can just hear how it sounds like an awkward attempt at poetry rather than natural speech. Honestly, if there's just one thing you take from this video, it should be to read your dialogue out loud because it is such an insanely useful tool to improve your writing. Now, this fourth mistake I'm about to show you is probably the most annoying one to read. So to explain this, let's look at another example of bad dialogue. For a bit of context, in this scene, our protagonist, who is called Ravina, and her mentor figure called Arno, are walking along a defensive wall that overlooks the sea beside their town. "As you know, the sea monsters attacked our town 30 years ago, said Arno. "Yes," said Ravina. "It was devastating. We weren't ready for them at all." "That's right. They slaughtered many of us, including your uncle." Ravina nodded. Her father had told her this. "Anyhow," said Arno, "let us return to my quarters." Okay, so that example sucks, right? Like we're in agreement on that. But why is that actually the case? Well, the big mistake here is we have InfoDialogue. This is where you're using your dialogue purely to infodump exposition or information about your world and characters. And this results in a boring, stilted, and just unrealistic conversation. The biggest problem here is that when you write InfoDialogue, it doesn't feel like it's something that your characters would naturally say. It actually is just turning them into a mouthpiece for you as an author, and readers absolutely hate that. To quote from Joe Abercrombie, "When you write dialogue, you have to ask the question, would this character really say these words in this situation? Everything that seems dishonest, that seems unconvincing, that seems untrue, weakens the effect. But if you keep honest, you can't go too far wrong." So, how do you actually fix InfoDialogue? Well, I'm not going to tell you to cut it entirely because sometimes you really do need to explain the background of how the sea monsters attacked. But there is a way to do it with class and a bit of style. The answer is actually pretty simple. Always make sure that every piece of dialogue is motivated, that your characters have a genuine reason to say what they are saying. Dialogue is verbal action. It is a tool that characters use to get something they want. So if we rework our bad example from before, we might get this. Ravina reached the top of the stairs and collapsed onto the seawall, groaning. Arno frowned down at her. "Did I say you could stop?" he asked. Ravina panted. "Just give me a moment to catch my breath." Arno struck her with his cane. She yelped. "The monsters won't let you rest," Arno said. "Do you know what it's like to face them? Of course not. You're just a sheltered child who's never seen the horrors of this world. You don't know what it was like when they attacked us 30 years ago. But I do. And so did your uncle, God's rest his soul. Now get up and keep going." We're still getting all the same core information across, but it's just slipped in there. It's a little bit like if you're baking brownies for your kid and you decide to chop up some hidden vegetables to put inside so that you can deliver some important nutrients in a very tasty package. To give two specific tips here, first of all, conflict makes almost every dialogue exchange way more interesting. If there is a completely cooperative relationship between both characters in a scene, then you probably want to shorten that dialogue exchange as much as possible, or maybe even cut it entirely. As you can see from my refined example here, You can, and often should, have conflict even between allies or even between friends in your story. And the second thing is that whenever you have exposition you want to share, such as the exposition that the sea monsters attacked 30 years ago and they killed the main character's uncle here, you want to be using that exposition as ammunition. Have the characters use it as a weapon to get something they want. In this case, Arnold is using that exposition to get Ravina to be a bit more motivated for her training. So when you do this, you can infodump as much as you damn well please. Now, the next dialogue mistake is a very counterintuitive one that a lot of writers don't realize. And to explain this fifth mistake, let's imagine you're reading a scene where a group of explorers discover an ancient underground temple. "Look at this place," Mara said. "It's massive." "Yes, and these walls are covered in strange symbols," Rion said. "I think it's some kind of ancient writing." "It smells old," said Tarek, "like dust and decay." "There's a statue over there," Mara said. "Looks like some kind of warrior." "Be careful," Rion said. "There could be traps." "I don't like this," Tarek said. "Let's move carefully." "Wait," Mara whispered. "I think I just heard something moving in the dark." So, what's wrong here? Well, in my opinion, there is a huge over-reliance on dialogue. This scene is basically just characters walking into this place and narrating what they see and hear and smell instead of the author actually describing it. Now, sometimes that can actually work, but for a scene like this, where you're stepping into this ancient temple for the first time, you really want to evoke a sense of wonder. You want to immerse the reader in that experience, and dialogue is not always the best way to do that. See, as a writer, you have access to 4 main story forms to share your narrative. The first one is dialogue, so what characters say to each other. But the second one is description. So this is what your point of view character observes about the environment around them. The third mode is action, so what characters physically do and how they interact with the world. And then the last mode is internal thought. These are ideas that your point of view character sort of processes within their own mind. The best fantasy writers have mastered the art of braiding. They take all these 4 elements of action, dialogue, description, and internal thought, and they weave them together to create this seamless fusion of character development, plot progression, and world building all at the same time. So let's take these 4 story forms and braid them together to improve our bad example. And you're going to see here that I'm color coding each mode so that you can track what's actually happening. The dark stone archway loomed before Mara and her group, swallowing their torchlight. She sniffed. The cold air was damp with the scent of something long buried. "You go first, Mara," said Rion in a squeaky voice. She shook her head. Typical. Still, there was no sense waiting, so she strode inside. Her boots echoed on the dusty stones. How many centuries had passed since someone had walked here? Her torch cast flickering orange light across the walls, revealing intricate carvings, stretching all the way up until the shadows devoured her light. "Tarek, get in here and take a look at these," she said. The old scholar shuffled in. A moment later, Rion followed, looking nervously from side to side, no doubt trying to find some golden totems to pocket. Tarek peered at the nearest carvings. "You recognize these?" Mara asked. Tarek trailed his wrinkled fingers over the markings. "They look like Etruscan script, a very old language, dead for many centuries." A hint of gold glinted ahead. Mara raised her torch, and the light caught on a huge bronze statue at the end of the chamber. It was some kind of giant, ancient warrior. Rion grinned. "Now there's something to make this miserable journey worthwhile." Tarek was still frowning at the inscriptions. Mara's skin prickled with unease. "Can you read it?" she asked. "Yes," whispered Tarek. "What does it say?" He was quiet a moment. "It's a warning." A breath of wind caressed her face, bringing with it a horribly stale stench. In the distance, something groaned. Mara's heart skipped a beat. We're not alone. So obviously this is a longer example here, but don't you feel so much more tension and immersion in this scene? The environment feels far more alive, and we actually feel like we are experiencing it alongside the characters. And by the way, if you do like stories where characters are uncovering ancient temples and going on quests to unravel ancient mysteries and doing this kind of Indiana Jones style exploring, I literally wrote a whole space fantasy novel about this called Across the Broken Stars. And it recently received this lovely review. "One of the best fantasy books I've read. The pacing keeps the entire book alive, the story is constantly progressing. It was heart-wrenching, action-packed, inspiring, comical in some places, and the twist completely caught me off guard. The novel deals with some very excellent themes and ideas that are explored through a fantastical lens in a very intriguing fictional world. I felt like I knew the characters personally, and I'm actually sad that I finished the book." So if you want to pick up this book, I'll link to it in the description down below. Okay, so to explain the sixth big dialogue mistake, I'm going to share one of my favorite pieces of writing ever. But first, let me explain the mistake. This sixth mistake is writing aimless conversations. When we're talking in real life, it's very common to have pointless small talk. You're chatting with someone about the weather or about last weekend's sports game or some other mundane topic. Maybe you're catching up with a colleague at work and the conversation goes something like this. How are you doing? Oh, not too bad. How about you? Yeah, I'm doing all right. Crazy weather we're having, huh? Now, in reality, small talk serves a useful social function, as frustrating as it can be, but in a novel, it is boring. Readers don't want to sit through characters just exchanging these surface-level pleasantries. And yet, many new fantasy writers make this mistake because they think the goal is to write realistic dialogue. But I want you to know that's a huge mistake, because here is the thing. Realistic dialogue is not good dialogue. Actual conversations are full of boring small talk, filler words, ums and ahs, interruptions, and lots of half-finished thoughts. That's totally natural when you're talking with someone in real life, but it doesn't make for engaging storytelling. Instead, every line of dialogue in your novel should have a purpose. It should drive the story forward, it should develop your characters, and it should explore your themes. Put simply, your dialogue must feel consequential. Every exchange should matter. But here's the advanced part. You can still write dialogue that feels somewhat aimless while actually conveying something much deeper. And to show you how that works, I want to share one of my favorite movie scenes ever, which comes at the end of No Country for Old Men, a neo-Western based on the book written by, I've got it over here somewhere, Cormac McCarthy. So, at the end of the film, Ed Tom Bell, who is this now retired sheriff who has basically spent the entire story struggling with the increasing violence and chaos of the world, tells his wife about two dreams he had about his dead father. On the surface, it's just an old man talking about a dream, but beneath that, it's an entire character arc condensed down into a single monologue.
How'd you sleep?
I don't know. Had dreams.
Well, you got time for them now. Anything interesting?
There always is to the party concerned.
Ed Tom, I'll be polite. All right then, two of them. Both had my father in them.
It's peculiar. I'm older now than he ever was by 20 years. So, in a sense, he's the younger man.
Anyway, first one I don't remember too well, but it was about meeting him in town somewhere. He's going to give me some money. I think I lost it.
The second one, it was like we was both back in the older times. And I was a horseback, going through the mountains of a night.
Going through this pass in the mountains. It was cold, and there was snow on the ground, and he rode past me and kept on going. Never said nothing going by. He just rode on past. And he had his blanket wrapped around him, and his head down.
When he rode past, I seen he was carrying fire and a horn, the way people used to do. And I could see the horn from the light inside of it, about the color of the moon.
And in the dream, I knew that he was going on ahead.
He's fixing to make a fire somewhere out there in all that dark and all that cold. I knew that whenever I got there, he'd be there. Then I woke up.
So that's it. That's the final moment of the movie. It's lifted word for word, basically, from the last page of the novel. And ever since my grandpa passed away last year, at the ripe old age of 99, so he had an amazing innings, and I feel really grateful for the time I had with him. Ever since that happened, I find myself musing on this piece of dialogue every couple of months. It's just so beautifully poetic in a very abstract and minimal way, and it's incredibly loaded with meaning. And I imagine that the older I get, and maybe the more mortality I experience in my life, the more it will resonate with me as well. So to unpack this dialogue a bit further, it's doing three things really effectively. The first one is it is encapsulating the story's theme. Ed Tom has spent the entire novel wrestling with the idea that the world has become too dark, too violent, and too cruel. His father carrying this fire is a symbol of hope, of a past where justice made sense. The second thing it's doing really well is it gives closure to Bell's character arc. He has been struggling to find meaning in an increasingly chaotic world, and the dream suggests that he longs for a certain type of guidance, for a mentor to light the way, but when he wakes up, he's still in the dark. And then the last reason why this dialogue is so effective is because it really reinforces the story's very bleak tone. There's no resolution, there's no comforting answer, it's just a man reflecting on something that might not even really matter in this grand scheme of things. So, if you can find a way to carry this kind of emotional and thematic depth beneath the surface of your dialogue, your story is going to feel so much richer, so much more nuanced, and far more impactful for readers. But the thing is, you won't be able to reach that deeper meaning if you make the next mistake, because this 7th mistake is a huge immersion killer for fantasy readers, and the problem is, it only takes 1 or 2 words to accidentally create this error. So to explain this next mistake, let's imagine you're deep in an epic fantasy novel and it has a kind of medieval era setting. Think swords, castles, horses. You kind of know what I'm talking about here. Now, you are completely immersed in this world, but then a character suddenly says, "Dude, that was insane." Or maybe someone else says, "Yeah, I don't know, this whole Dark Lord thing kind of sucks, right?" Now, if you're anything like me, that just ripped you right out of the world. I'm not saying you necessarily have to write dialogue with a faux Shakespearean tone with lots of fully medieval appropriate word choices. If anything, that can actually be a mistake in the opposite direction, but nothing yanks a reader out of your fantasy world faster than anachronistic dialogue, which is this next mistake I'm talking about here. Anachronistic dialogue occurs when you say things that just feel far too modern or illogical or just don't really make sense for your setting. This is something that personally disappointed me in Wind and Truth, the 5th Stormlight archive book. Now, Stormlight, used to be my favorite fantasy series up until this latest installment, and there were some great moments in book 5, but for me, there were just too many instances where the dialogue felt way too modern. Characters were using slang and casual phrasing that didn't really match the image and mental picture I had built up in my mind of Roshar, which is where the story takes place. For instance, in earlier books, when you had characters that were romantically involved with each other, they would court each other. But in book 5, now they were dating. And I know that's a subtle thing, but it just didn't feel right to the style that the earlier books had established. Now, of course, with all of these mistakes, and whenever I do these mistakes videos, there's always nuance to this. As Sanderson himself said in a 2018 panel, this is what Tolkien said, and I always rely upon this. You're reading the book in translation, and the book translating it is going to try to use the closest in feel, but also make it translate to English. So even when they use idioms and things like that, sometimes they translate and the translator can drop them right in. Sometimes they just don't translate, so the translator comes up with something that works in English. It gets you a lot of loopholes, like if you accidentally call something an Ottoman, and people are like, "But there's not an Ottoman Empire in this fantasy world," but you're like, yeah, all words work that way. And Joe Abercrombie, who I've talked with on this channel before, has some really good notes on this topic as well, about realism in dialogue. In an article called "Zounds, Swearing in Fantasy," he writes, "Of course, fantasy is not history. Fantasies can include all kinds of different elements corresponding to different time periods. Furthermore, even if we are describing a pseudo-medieval setting, no one could pretend that we are writing for a medieval audience. As I see it, an author has to select the mode of expression which he feels best communicates his meaning, or the meaning of his characters, to a reader of modern English." So again, it's not about writing the dialogue the exact way people spoke 500 years ago, but what I would urge you to think about is that you just have to be careful about using your judgment around words, phrases, and slang that feels too modern or doesn't really feel appropriate for your setting and world, because there will be readers who are taken out of your story when they see that. The best thing you can do is just to run it past an editor or a fellow writer or a reader just to get their impression on things. Now, the next mistake is maybe the most common one I see amongst new fantasy writers, but once it's pointed out, it's super quick and super easy for you to fix. And this 8th mistake is incorrect dialogue formatting. So dialogue formatting, it trips up a lot of new writers. Like I said at the start of this video, I've run a lot of different writing classes and programs over the past few years. I've worked with over 150 writers through these so far, and to join these programs, writers need to send in a sample of their work to me. This means at this point I've read hundreds and hundreds of application samples from various writers. Some of them have been veterans of the publishing industry. They've been publishing for decades. They've got books out. Maybe they've even got comic books out, that kind of thing. And others are just starting. And whenever I'm reading these samples, incorrect dialogue formatting is one of the most obvious ways I spot an early stage writer. And you better believe that publishers, editors, and agents are going to notice it as well. But once you understand the correct formatting rules, it just becomes second nature. So let's start with the basics here. The first thing you need to know is that a dialogue tag is the part that attributes the line of dialogue to a speaker. For example, if I said, "We need to find the dragons," John said is the dialogue tag. Now, there are 5 main ways to correctly format your dialogue. I'm going to give you some dialogue examples to show this in action. You can have the tag come after the dialogue, John said. Susan raised her hand. Or you can use an action beat from the character who is speaking and attach it to the start of the dialogue. Or sometimes, said John, you can interject the dialogue tag in the middle. The U is lowercase because it's not the start of a sentence. You can make things more dynamic by blending an action beat with a tag, said Susan as she stood. You can also use an action beat within the dialogue. John stretched his arms above his head. That helps to make it more dynamic as well. And yes, there are a few other edge cases and alternative ways to lay things out, and you can get experimental if you know what you're doing. Cormac McCarthy, for instance, who I mentioned earlier in the video, he doesn't even use quotation marks, but personally, I find that a little bit annoying. So what I'm showing you are really just the essential basic fundamentals that 99% of writers should follow. So with that being said, let's go through some common formatting mistakes to avoid. The first mistake is capitalizing dialogue tags. So looking at this example here on the screen, we need to leave, he said, the he should not be capitalized. It should be a lowercase he like this because it's coming after the dialogue. The next mistake is using a period before the tag. So the storm is coming, full stop, she whispered. This is a mistake. It should be the storm is coming, comma, end quotation mark, she whispered. So you should always be using a comma before the tag unless the dialogue is ending with a question mark or an exclamation point. The next mistake is using action beats as tags. I'll handle it, she frowned. Now this doesn't really make sense because you can't frown words out of your mouth. That's not how it works. You can shout words, you can whisper words, but you can't frown words out of your mouth. So it's not a valid dialogue tag here. What you want to be doing here is treating it as a separate sentence with an action beat. So you can either go she frowned, full stop, I'll handle it, or you could go I'll handle it, she said, frowning. So that's kind of incorporating the action into the dialogue tag, but you're not having the action be the way the dialogue is getting expressed. The fourth mistake is misplacing punctuation. So you can see here, we've got are you sure? End quotation mark, question mark, he asked. That's incorrect. The punctuation should come inside the quotation mark. It should be are you sure? Question mark, end quotation mark, he asked. And then the fifth and last sort of main formatting mistake I want to share here is not starting a new paragraph after dialogue. So if we look at this example here, I'll do it. She grabbed the map from the table, then she marched towards the door, and we go on from there. So whenever a character finishes speaking and then performs a separate action or the story continues on, you should usually start a new paragraph. Otherwise, you end up with this really big, confusing block of text that makes it very hard to follow the flow of action. And you also need to keep this in mind when going to a new speaker. A new speaker should get a new paragraph so that we can clearly differentiate them. And that's really what this comes down to. Clean formatting isn't just about looking professional, it's about helping the reader clearly understand who is speaking rather than stumbling on your structure. And this brings me to the next mistake, which is poor selection of dialogue tags. Let me show you one of the most unintentionally funny lines of dialogue I've ever read. This comes from chapter 29 of Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. Snape, ejaculated Slughorn, who looked the most shaken, pale, and sweating. Snape, I taught him. I thought I knew him. Hard to take it seriously, right? Now, technically, ejaculated does mean to shout or say something suddenly, and it is used a lot in older writing, like if you read the Sherlock Holmes stories, Sherlock is ejaculating words all the time. But for most modern readers, it just takes your mind straight to the gutter. This is a classic example of the dialogue tag distracting us from the actual dialogue. In almost every instance, you want readers to focus on what's actually being said in the dialogue, not the tag that surrounds it, because most of the time, the tag just exists so that you can let us know who is speaking. Personally, I favor a very minimal approach to my tags. 99% of the time, I just use said and asked because these are practically invisible words that the reader will just skip over. They're not really abrasive to readers. By comparison, a lot of new writers think that they need to be extremely varied and very florid with their tags, which results in writing that looks like this. I hate you, she exclaimed. Well, not as much as I hate you, he fumed. Why do you have to be like this? She exclaimed. Because you made me this way, he extolled. Now, the occasional spicy dialogue tag or exotic dialogue tag is okay, but when every single tag is trying to stand out, it becomes very noisy and very distracting for readers. Plus, in many cases, if you're feeling like you need to use your dialogue tag to clearly tell the emotion of what your characters are saying, it may be a sign that the dialogue wasn't crafted well enough to show readers in the first place. Now, of course, there are always exceptions for this. If we consider this dialogue here, I'll never betray you, he promised. The promised is a bit unnecessary here. I'll never betray you is obviously a promise, so we don't really need to repeat it in the dialogue tag. However, if we have a look at this, I'll never betray you, he lied. Wow, okay, so now this is actually doing something a bit different because there's more tension here between what the character is saying and what they actually mean. Obviously, you can only really do this if the speaker is the point of view character in your story, but it is a powerful technique. Let's look at another example of how the right dialogue tag can make a big difference. If we imagine a scene where a character is being interrogated and they say this, "You're not getting anything out of me," he said. That's okay. But consider how the right dialogue tag completely changes the meaning of this. You're not getting anything out of me, he whimpered. "You're not getting anything out of me," he growled. Exact same dialogue, very different meaning. In one case, our speaker sounds afraid, in the other, they sound defiant. So to summarize this point, most of the time, just use said and asked because they are practically invisible and readers will just kind of skip over them. But when your dialogue tag meaningfully changes or adds to the meaning or the intention of the speech, then you may want to spice it up a little bit. And this brings me to the 10th big dialogue mistake that new fantasy writers make. One of the biggest issues I see in beginner dialogue is repetition. Characters rehashing the same idea multiple times, often with slightly different phrasing, but without actually progressing the conversation forward. Here's a bad example. "The king is dead." "The king is dead? That's what I said, isn't it? I just can't believe it. The king? He's really dead? That's what I said. Gods, I just can't believe it." So here, every line is circling the same idea without actually moving things forward. There's no new information that's added by line 6 as opposed to line 1. It's just echoing what's already been said. Now, this can sometimes be an effective technique for writing comedy, but in most cases, this creates fluff and it really slows the pacing of your scene. Here's another example. "Would you like to see the wizard's staff, young master?" "Yes, please." "It is over there." "Up on the shelf?" "Yes." "All right, I'll grab it now." This exchange could be trimmed down to just 1 or 2 lines and nothing meaningful would be lost. Each line is just bouncing back and forth without any tension, subtext, or new insight. So, how do you fix this mistake? Well, every line of dialogue should do something new. It could reveal new information, shift the power dynamic between characters, show character emotion or motivation, raise the stakes, or move the plot forward. And ideally, you can try to do all of these at the same time. New writers often add too much padding to their dialogue with lots of long-winded lines or redundant exchanges. But in my experience, the more compressed your dialogue becomes, the better it usually feels. When I'm writing my books, I actually have a dedicated editing pass where I go through my draft and I focus on just tightening and improving my dialogue by using all the principles we've discussed in this video. Now, if you want to level up your dialogue even further, watch this video where I break down examples of good and bad dialogue in several fantasy movies and TV shows. Keep writing and keep striving.